Module 2, Origins of Jazz, for Music 112, Introduction to Jazz.
Hi everyone, it's Ms. Cary, and this week we're going to look at Module 2, The Origins of Jazz.
To understand jazz, we must first understand its origins. Jazz is the result of syncretism, or the blending of two or more distinct and originally separate cultural elements. The United States, since before its formation into a nation, has been home to people of many different nations, ethnicities, and cultures. This is a picture of Louis Armstrong, who is known as the ambassador of jazz. And here he is with his trumpet. He came from New Orleans, and that is one of the places where jazz developed first. Ethnocentrism. At times, ethnocentrism and other forms of cultural and social prejudices have been established by more powerful groups and subcultures in the United States to suppress or eliminate the cultural norms and activities of less powerful groups, specifically white Americans from Western Europe, a group that held most of the wealth and power for much of American history, made every effort to suppress and even eliminate the culture of Black Americans. In spite of this suppression by the white majority, the culture of Black Americans not only persevered, but became the foundation of almost all of the music we listen to today. Everything from country to rock to hip-hop. Jazz is a predominantly Black American art form that is central to the story of not only American music, but American history. This is a picture of Jimi Hendrix, the famous rock and roll guitarist, performing for a Dutch television show, Hopla, in 1967. While other ethnic groups, such as European or Latin American, have played an enormous role in the creation of jazz, it was the contributions of Africans living in the United States that had the greatest impact on the development of jazz as a musical genre. Jazz is a musical genre characterized by freedom of expression. So it is not surprising that it was developed by people with a tragically oppressed history. To truly understand jazz, we must also understand the historical influence of slavery and how various individuals and groups within African American society reacted to this inhumane and long-lived institution. Here is a map of Africa, and it's marked by the slave trade. A lot of the slaves that came to America came from West Africa. This is a map of slave trade from Africa to the Americas from 1650 to 1860. The first Africans were brought to the United States in 1619 to Jamestown. The majority of the slaves were exported from West Africa via the transatlantic slave trade, a massive economic operation which resulted in the forced relocation of over 12 million Africans to the New World. The conditions the African slaves experienced crossing the Atlantic were horrifying, with many dying during the voyage as a result of dirty, stable-like conditions and a brutal shipboard regime. Upon reaching their destination in the Americas, the situation for most slaves worsened. Children could be sold and separated from their parents, and enslaved women were often raped. In spite of these horrors, American slaves retained their cultural roots while also assimilating the sounds of various ethnic groups throughout the New World. Here we have the 1860 U.S. slave census that shows how many slaves per state. And you can see by the red and pink that it's all in the South. And Virginia, North Carolina, Alabama, and Florida have slave states that have apologized for slavery. And then the other states have not apologized for slavery. The green states were the free states. Here's the same information in the original map. Now notice along the Mississippi River down to New Orleans and how the area is the darkest shade, meaning there's a more concentration of slaves. New Orleans was especially a melting pot, allowing the African American population to publicly express their cultural identity through performance in open spaces. Congo Square, now the site of Louis Armstrong Park, from the first slide with his trumpet. Congo Square formed a gathering place for recently transplanted African slaves, as well as old generations of blacks born in the New World to observe their indigenous traditions. A people removed by force from their homeland, the displaced African Americans, both slaves and freed blacks, congregated on Sunday afternoons to celebrate the traditions of their African homeland. Let's take a look at the music of the Southern slaves. Slave owners encouraged musical activity. Slaves would play both in service of whites at balls, parties, etc., and for their own enjoyment. Few slaves could read or write musical notation. Frequent improvisation and variation made documentation of this music difficult. Southern slave composition. Mostly homemade instruments. The most common instruments on the plantations were the fiddle and the banjo. The fiddle is the folk version of the violin. It's associated with the European tradition. The banjo is guitarish, an adaptation of African instruments, most associated with Southern blacks. Drums were outlawed by whites, so slaves couldn't use them to send messages. Slaves used their bodies as percussion instruments, known as padding juba. It's done by placing one foot a little in advance of the other, raising the ball of the foot from the ground and striking it in regular time, while in connection the hands are struck slightly together, then upon the thighs. This is a picture of slave music from the Caribbean. You can see there's a dance going on, and the musicians have a banjo made from a gourd and a drum. On the ground are jugs that they used to help amplify their voices, doing a rhythmic kind of trombone sound across the top of the jug, pursing their lips like that with a pitch like that, and the jug would make it sound like a bass. A close-up of the musicians. This is a banjo from the 1800s. The wooden parts would all have been carved. The head is an animal skin, probably a groundhog. And there's a metal tailpiece, a metal ring to hold it all together, and metal brackets, which would have been forged by a blacksmith. Here's another Baroque painting of a musician in the Caribbean. His banjo has a wooden body, and it looks like gut strings, which would have been dried intestines from the calf guts. This is an African banjo that the American banjo derived from. This is a gourd banjo. This is a painting called The Banjo Lesson by Henry Asawa Tanner, painted in 1893. Here we see an etching of slave music. He's playing a homemade fiddle, and the man in the back just might be patting Juba, and the kids are dancing and playing. This is a scene from Congo Square in New Orleans during the days of the slave trade. There's a banjo. Those blocks are where they would put the slaves up to sell them. A musical bow is the ancestor of all the instruments. It is the oldest and one of the most widely used string instruments of Africa. It consists of a single string attached to each end of a curved stick Similar to a bow and arrow, the string is either plucked or struck with another stick. This instrument migrated to America with the slave trade and is also considered an Appalachian instrument, early American folk instrument. So the idea is that you sing pitches with your voice and you play the mouth bow, and it affects the sound and amplifies the sound. You change the shape of the inside of your mouth to change the tone of the notes. Here is an Appalachian version of the mouth bow. This is a more modern version of a mouth bow with a tin can on the end to amplify the sound. The pan flute is a slave instrument that migrated from Africa, taking pieces of sugar cane or bamboo, hollowing them out with a burnt stick and strapping them together to have a scale was common in slave communities. This is a cane flute made from sugar cane that belonged to Otha Turner, a famous blues flute player who carried on the tradition of slave flute music rooted in West African flute music. This is a picture of Napoleon Strickland, the man that Otha Turner learned from. This is a cajon, a slave drum. Because drumming was outlawed, this was designed to look like a box or a chest, but it was a secret drum designed to sound good and play different pitches. Here you see a modern cajon. This is the historical marker at Congo Square. I'm just going to go ahead and read it to you. Congo Square is in the vicinity of a spot which Humas Indians used before the arrival of the French for celebrating their annual corn harvest and was considered sacred ground. The gathering of enslaved African vendors in Congo Square originated as early as the late 1740s during Louisiana's French colonial period and continued during the Spanish colonial era as one of the city's public markets. By 1803, Congo Square had become famous for the gatherings of enslaved Africans who drummed, danced, sang, and traded many on Sunday afternoons. By 1819, these gatherings numbered as many as 500 to 600 people. Among the most famous dances were the bambula, the kalinda, and the Congo. These African cultural expressions gradually developed into Mardi Gras Indian traditions, the second line, and eventually New Orleans jazz and rhythm and blues. The Bambula, an etching by Edward W. Kemble that accompanied George Washington Cable's description of dancing in Congo Square, published in 1886, decades after the gatherings had been prohibited. Another artist's rendering of dancing at Congo Square. This is the Kalinda. A photograph from the late 1800s of the gathering at Congo Square and the trading. One of the most common rituals performed at these gatherings was the ring shout, a community dance where several people move in a circular pattern in counterclockwise steps to a syncopated rhythmic pattern. This would later transform into the second line that is still practiced today in various social events by New Orleans brass bands, and survive into the early 20th century in other parts of the Southeast. Today, the ring shout is still practiced as a musical social tradition in parts of South Carolina and Georgia by the Gullah communities. Here's a picture of a ring shout. A clearer version of the picture. You can see banjos. The word shout, though it sounds like it would come from people shouting, it's actually a word to describe the dance, and it comes from the African word shout, spelled S-E-A-T. Shout. This is a picture of the Georgia Sea Island shouters continuing the dance of the ring shout tradition. Another artist's rendering of the ring shout. Thinking about call and response, which is part of the origins of jazz. The person in the middle with the stick keeps the beat and leads the calls. The group answers back, and that's the response. They would have the ring shout in the praise house, their church, and they would do it Saturday night into Sunday morning. These praise houses are still there in the historical Georgia Sea Island Gullah communities. Another praise house. An artist's interpretation of the ring shout inside the praise house. An early photograph of a ring shout in the praise house. A picture of the ring shout performed by a group from Haiti. Here is how the dance would work. The ring shout dance, which is counterclockwise march, is based upon the movement of the sun that rises in the east, peaks in the north, sets in the west, and is reborn in the south. If you recall from the Congo Square marker, the music from Congo Square developed later into Mardi Gras. And in other places, the music from the ring shout also was used for festivals. Here's a picture of the Three Kings Day Festival in Havana, Cuba. Be sure to check in with the ebook and click on the video links for the Georgia Sea Island Shouters so that you can hear the music from the ring shout that has been kept alive with no break in the Gullah Geechee communities. This is a picture of the Second Line Parade in New Orleans that developed out of the Ring Shout March. They use the same step and they progress down the street with the musicians leading the way. They'll have a second line for weddings and funerals and birthday celebrations. Syncopated music, or music that is syncopated, refers to music where the rhythmic emphasis is not on the main stressed beats of the measure. For example, a measure of 4 beats would normally be counted as 1, 2, 3, 4. And the underlying rhythmic groove or feel would emphasize these 4 main beats. We hear this very often in rock and roll. Syncopation occurs when the beats in between or off the main beats in a measure are emphasized. For example, 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. Syncopation may also refer to the emphasis of beats between 2 and 4 in a measure containing 4 beats. This is characteristic of much jazz music, where the rhythm of 1, 2, 3, 4 places emphasis on the traditionally weaker beats of 2 and 4. So let's try it together. Slowly count with me. 1, 2, 3, 4. Keep going. 1, 2, 3, 4. Keep going. And now I want you to clap in between 1 and 2 and 3 and 4. Keep going. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4. Stop. Good. So that emphasizing the weak parts, the usually quiet parts, turns things on its head a little bit for folks that are used to Western music, Western European style music, which usually emphasizes 1, oh, let me clap. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2. I often think right, left, right, left. Strong, weak, strong, weak. What if you made that opposite? Let's clap on 2 and 4. Ready, go. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. So that is commonplace in West African music, and it really made things sound different when you apply these syncopated rhythms to European melodies. Many elements of traditional African music were incorporated into gatherings at Congo Square. The first element was a focus on sound and the unique approach each individual brings to crafting their own sound when singing and or playing an instrument. In Africa, sound is derived from two places: the surrounding natural world and the human body itself. Across various cultures on the African continent, one can see an emphasis on the manipulation of nature-based materials and the human body to create music. Two examples from the Baka people of Central Africa are going to be shown in the next two slides. First, you'll see the Angbindi, or earth bow, and then the Likwindi, a type of water drumming. This picture is of West African drummers. Here is the earth bow, which is a stick with a string tied around something and buried in the ground. And then the other video is water drumming. So be sure to listen in the ebook by clicking on the YouTube links. The creative use of environmental material to create sound was retained in the New World, where the instruments musicians performed on were built from local materials, but similar in design and sound to African instruments. Percussion and the human voice played a prominent role, with instruments created from whatever materials were available. This creativity manifested itself in the creation of drums, shakers, rattles, and various percussion instruments, which could be struck, scraped, shaken, or manipulated in a myriad of ways to provide a variety of sounds for the performers involved. One example we just saw in the Ring Shout video was the transformation of the washboard, an object initially used as a cleaning tool, into a musical instrument. The oppression that Black Americans, both freed and enslaved, was often economic. With few resources available, Black American communities used creative measures to create everything from washboards to washtub bases, spoons, and a single stringed instrument known as the diddley bow, which was often just a nail nailed into the side of a barn with a string tied around it and wrapped over a board. And you would pluck it and push it down to make it change pitch. This picture is from colonial times, from the Caribbean, and in the painting, he is playing the bones. Drums are also integral to Black American music. More than just a musical instrument, drums were also viewed as a vessel for a spiritual connection between Black Americans and their ancestors in Africa. Today, these spiritual connections are still observed in many parts of West Africa. Drums also provided a means of communication over long distances and served as a voice to the oppressed, slave population of the New World, but perhaps more significantly, they represented a second important element of African music, rhythm. Rhythm was more than just a foundational component of music making. Rhythm represented freedom from oppression, both in a metaphorical and literal context. One such historical example which outlines the significance of rhythm in African American music can be seen in the Stono Rebellion of 1739, where specific rhythms played on large African drums were used as a form of communication over long distance. Jemmy, a slave originally from Angola, formed this rebellion as a revolt against their oppressive owners on the Stono River, near what is currently Charleston, South Carolina. The revolt was unsuccessful and resulted in the Negro Act, legislation created by white settlers to prevent such an uprising from reoccurring. The result was the banning of the use of drums by slaves. Other states followed suit, with Georgia going so far as banning the use of any loud instruments, including horns. There's a video of drummers from Africa playing together, which is a perfect example of polyrhythms. Many rhythms played at the same time. Be sure to check in with the ebook and play the video link so that you can hear what polyrhythm sounds like. Call and response is just what it sounds like. A leader calls out a musical phrase and the group responds back with a musical phrase. And it was very common in West African traditional music. Be sure to listen in your ebook to this work song collected by the Library of Congress that has an example of call and response. A discussion of the African influence on jazz would be incomplete without a brief explanation of one of the most influential rhythms, the son clave, a rhythmic export from slaves in Cuba, manifested itself in the percussion accents of ring shouts and New Orleans second line music. Notation and listening links are provided in the textbook. Here's an example of the forward clave rhythm and the reverse clave rhythm. So slowly, I'm going to establish our beat and then I'm going to clap the forward clave rhythm several times. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3. One more time. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3. Now a little faster. Great. The reverse clave rhythm is the same thing, but you just start with the second half. The fifth and perhaps most important element of African music that would influence jazz is structured improvisation. Structured improvisation is music where new ideas are spontaneously played or sung by the performers over a pre-existing song, rhythmic pattern, or musical form. Jazz represents only one musical tradition to use this style, as it is integral to not only many African musical styles and traditions, but many African American styles and musical traditions, including blues, funk, gospel, rap, and hip hop, just to name a few. In the next slide, you will hear some early examples of structured improvisation. Structured improvisation means that the improvisation occurs over a pre-existing form or melody. So you might sing the melody one way, and then when it's your turn to improvise, you change the melody up however you want. Listen in the ebook to this example of structured improvisation. European influence. The European settlers in the New World also played an important role in the shaping of jazz music in the 19th century, albeit in a smaller way than people from Africa. Much of jazz harmony is rooted in harmonic practices, or systems of harmonic progressions designed to support melodies, which date back to the 1600s when modern musical ideas began to develop in Western Europe. The development of standard chord progressions, or a sequence of chords designed to support a variety of melodies, continues to hold a major impact in many musical genres today. Jazz musicians will memorize various chord progressions which work over a number of tunes. There are videos in your text that will demonstrate how these chord progressions work. This picture is of John Philip Sousa and his band. In the 1860s, the number one popular type of music all over the world was oompa bands, and marching bands were very popular in America. So this is part of the European influence that affected jazz in the early origins of jazz. Minstrel music. History shows us that art is never born in a vacuum. This is true of African American music, which intersected with many other cultural trends through American history. The intersection of black and white music has a complex history, most strongly represented in a racist cultural practice of 19th century America, minstrel music. This style is a unique example of a dominant and oppressive culture, white America, mocking an oppressed culture, black America, through music and dance. Minstrel music was a genre developed by white performers mimicking, in an overtly derogatory fashion, African American music. White performers would don blackface in performance and exaggerate the musical sounds and choreography of various forms of black music, which had developed in America. Sadly, this practice was still considered acceptable well into the mid-20th century, and is still practiced as a form of racial discrimination toward Black Americans today. Within this story, however, is one silver lining. African American performers turn the tables by excelling at this genre themselves, with one such performer, William Henry Lane, becoming the unparalleled performer in this genre. More than just an entertainer, he was also a talented multi-instrumentalist, playing a variety of instruments, including violin, banjo, spoons, and tambourine, and combined traditional Irish step dancing and African American dancing to create a new form of dance, tap dance. William Henry Lane, however, was more than just a brilliant musician and the inventor of tap dancing. He was the first African American to receive higher billing than a white performer in a minstrel show. His stage name, Master Juba, possesses a dichotomous nature, as Juba was commonly adopted name by slaves who sang and danced. However, the title of Master established Juba as an individual in control of his own performance career and ultimately destiny. He eventually relocated to London, England, where slavery had been abolished, and became an even bigger celebrity there than he had been in the United States. While minstrel music would ultimately be seen as a racially deriding musical genre, it is important to recognize the contributions and perseverance of Lane, who, long before jazz became America's classical music, single-handedly invented an entirely new style of dance with tap dancing. Further complicating the intersectionality of black and white music in American history is the music of Stephen Foster, a prolific 19th century composer. Foster is often referred to as the father of American folk music. This is because a century before jazz musicians would interpret popular songs, standards, and selections from Broadway musicals, Foster was writing popular songs in a myriad of genres which would be widely emulated and performed by 19th century musicians. Foster wrote hymns, choral anthems, popular folk songs, and minstrel music, and was so successful that he became the first self-supporting American composer, earning his income entirely, albeit only for a period of time, from sheet music sales of his compositions. So you can see next to the picture of Stephen Foster is one of his compositions to be played on the piano. Maybe you have heard it before. Oh, Susanna. Despite Stephen Foster's contributions as a composer, he represents a controversial figure in American history. A supporter of slavery, Foster made much of his wealth by writing songs for minstrel shows. Many of these songs, including Camptown Races and Dixie, were enormously popular, not only in the 19th century, but well into the 20th century. However, many of these songs contain lyrics that were pro-Southern, supporting slavery, a slave-based economy, and the dehumanization of Black Americans. It is worth noting that Foster's attitudes changed over time, and he ultimately refused to have racist depictions of African Americans on the covers of his sheet music. Still, his musical legacy represents the racist practices of 19th century America, the effects of which can still be felt today. Ragtime. Ragtime was instrumental, pun intended, in the development of jazz. In the early years of jazz music, both genres were often difficult to distinguish from one another. Jelly Roll Morton, who we will learn about in the next module, was too quick to point out how similar jazz in the early days and ragtime were so congruent in shared elements that they were often viewed as one and the same. In spite of Morton's assertion, there are fundamental differences between the two styles. First, ragtime is exclusively a solo piano genre. That is to say, rags or ragtime compositions were intended for solo piano. However, it was not uncommon, and is still not uncommon, for performers on instruments like banjo, guitar, and xylophone to also play ragtime pieces originally written for the piano. Secondly, ragtime is notated in the form of sheet music. While the performer would often make slight deviations from the written score, they would often stick close to the notes on the page. This is a fundamental difference from jazz, a musical genre where improvisation is a core element. Finally, ragtime music follows a set form, or logical pattern of musical themes, which act as a template for the composer. Ragtime is set to the form A, A, B, B, A, C, C, D, D. This may seem difficult to grasp at first, but each letter is simply an indication of a different theme, with 4 different themes appearing in the listed order. Let's listen to the maple leaf rag. The details about the form are listed in your textbook, but see if you can just hear when a section is repeated. The listening link for the maple leaf rag can be found in your ebook. Scott Joplin is arguably one of the most significant composers of American music in that he developed a unique style that has become a respected part of the Western musical canon. However, Joplin's musical creation wasn't born in a vacuum. His influences were manifold. While ragtime is a genre for solo piano, it is influenced by a very unlikely instrument, the banjo. Played by settlers of Scottish-Irish descent in Appalachian folk style, the banjo was originally created by African Americans in the South. This is not surprising when one considers the African origins of the instrument, an often neglected fact. Growing up in rural Arkansas in the 1870s, Joplin often listened to his mother, Florence, play syncopated melodies on the banjo. Florence Joplin was part of a larger African American musical tradition of banjo playing prevalent in the southern United States in the 19th century. Indeed, the repertoire and playing techniques used in the 19th century African American banjo tradition, often heard by white audiences in the minstrel shows and rural folk music of the southern United States, was the genesis for the melodies that would ultimately characterize ragtime. This Black tradition was also a significant influence on the Appalachian music tradition in styles like old-time music, bluegrass, and country. It is only in the last few decades that research has uncovered the Black origins of these musical genres that were erroneously categorized as exclusively white musical tradition for too many years. In the 1880s and 1890s, Joplin was also influenced by the popular sound of American brass bands, notably the music of John Philip Sousa. The AABBACCDD form of Joplin's rags was taken directly from the same form Sousa utilized in his March compositions, including the national anthem, Stars and Stripes Forever. However, Sousa's influences didn't stop with form. The oompa rhythm of the tubas in his marches provided the left-handed accompaniment pattern for ragtime music. It should be also noted that Joplin was not the first person to write a rag. That honor goes to William Krell. However, Krell and many other ragtime composers lacked the melodic ingenuity of Joplin's catchy and hummable works. Indeed, Joplin's rags, including Maple Leaf Rag, The Entertainer, Peacherine Rag, and Heliotrope Bouquet, were not only popular during Joplin's lifetime, but remain popular among listeners and pianists alike today. In spite of his success as the king of ragtime, Joplin was frustrated as a composer. Often pigeonholed, exclusively viewed as a composer of rags, the young composer had aspirations for grander things. Joplin also had to deal with the prejudice of an area that limited the performance of African American compositions to the piano bars of Mississippi steamboats and Southern saloons. A diligent student of the Western classical canon, Joplin wanted to tackle larger forms, such as operas and symphonies, and see them come to life in the concert halls of the United States and Europe. He began to turn his attention towards the creation of an opera, Tremonisha, a massive work combining the German and Italian opera tradition with African American folk music. Joplin financed the work himself, using the earnings from his rag sales to fund a performance in Harlem Hall in 1915. The work was not well received, and Joplin began a downward psychological spiral. He was committed to the Manhattan State Hospital and died of dementia on April 1st, 1917. It was only a half a century after his death that Joplin's music began to see a revival with the use of many of his rags, including the popular The Entertainer in the 1973 film The Sting. 2 years later, in 1975, Joplin received a posthumous Pulitzer Prize for Tremonisha. The blues. The blues, often referred to as jazz's cousin, originated in the rural southern United States in the 19th century. Developed by African Americans as a form of catharsis to deal with the hardships of slavery, and in the Reconstruction period following the Civil War, poverty. The blues came to possess multiple meanings by the end of the 19th century. The blues was a feeling representing melancholy. As early as 1853, the word appeared in print to represent a sad affectation. But the blues also represents a musical genre, possessing certain musical characteristics. Most significantly, the blues is a vocal style of music with its emphasis on the lyrics and the performer. The first blues piece was published in 1912, and the genre reached a level of popularity only shared by ragtime in the first two decades of the 20th century, when W.C. Handy published his St. Louis Blues in 1914. However, the blues had already existed as a Southern black musical art form and established for decades before it was inscribed in sheet music. The blues were initially an improvisatory style, played in the 1880s and 1890s, performed by solo musicians singing and playing instruments like banjo and fiddle, and then later guitar, thanks to the availability and affordability of the instrument in the popular Sears and Roebuck's catalog. For much of its early history, blues musicians were predominantly situated in the Delta region of the Mississippi River Basin. The rustic, rural, and isolated geography of this region provided a backdrop for the dramatic and provocative themes of this music, including loneliness, sin, alcoholism, life on the road, and love, often expressed in lascivious lyrics. This style, known as the Delta Blues, was characterized by a solo performer who sang with a unique and haunting approach. Delta blues musicians placed an emphasis on dissonant notes accompanied by vocal slides, where the performer, instead of resolving to a consonant pitch, revolved around the notes, often bending them to create tension in the music. This was coupled with an atypical approach to performance on various string instruments, most notably the guitar, where a broken beer bottle, knife, or piece of glass was used to slide up and down the strings to mimic the bent pitches of the performer's voice. In spite of its long history, the blues were not recorded until the 1920s, when race records, or records marked specifically towards African Americans, began to see the potential for this distinct style of music. What is perhaps more surprising is that the first blues records departed from the Delta style, instead choosing to focus on female singers accompanied by a pianist or full band. This subgenre, which would come to be known as classic blues, was an overnight success when Mamie Smith, who is the first lady of the blues, made the first blues recording in 1920. It was called Crazy Blues and would eventually sell 800,000 copies. With the success of this record, larger labels such as Columbia Records saw the commercial potential in recording the blues. The production of race records soon became widespread. In March of 1921, Harry Pace established Black Swan, the first record company in history to be owned and operated by an African American. In the early years of the company, he recorded numerous jazz and blues artists, but ironically turned down a young singer from Chattanooga, Tennessee, who would become the most famous of the classic blues artists. Bessie Smith, a vaudeville entertainer who had begun performing on street corners as a singer and dancer as early as the age of 9, would provide Columbia Records with one of their biggest hits. Decades when her recording, Downhearted Blues, sold 500,000 copies in 1923. Smith, the Empress of the Blues, was a stoic individual, many years ahead of her time and often outspoken. In the 1920s, a decade when both American women and African Americans were only beginning to find their voice in a culture that had silenced their voice for centuries, Smith stood out as an independent spirit who provided the public a voice for both disenfranchised demographics. One account in particular emphasizes Smith's status and strength. While on the road in 1927, Smith was confronted by the Ku Klux Klan, who surrounded her tent at a show in North Carolina. Smith responded with such intimidation that she scared off the invading Klan and resumed the performance. Let's listen to Bessie Smith's recording of Downhearted Blues from 1923. Listen in your ebook to the Downhearted Blues from Bessie Smith to hear an example of classic blues singing. Bessie Smith, as well as Mamie Smith and Gertrude Ma Rainey, represented a trinity of classic blues singers who transformed the old Delta style into a more theatrical and polished musical setting. Collaborating closely with New York composers such as W.C. Handy, these singers forged a new sound and performance art, often bringing a full band, lighting, props, and other showbiz accessories to their extravagantly produced shows throughout the United States. By sharp contrast, the Delta blues, ironically recorded after the classic blues recordings, retained its rustic and direct sound when it was first recorded in the late 1920s. One of the earliest artists, Blind Lemon Jefferson, recorded several hits for Paramount in the Delta blues style, proving to record executives that the refined sound of the classic blues were not the only profitable sound in the blues idiom. After Lemon's passing in 1929, several other Delta musicians recognized the opportunity for commercial success. Son House, a former preacher, wrote blues compositions inspired by biblical passages, and Charlie Patton was known for adding a show business element to his performance, playing the guitar behind his back and striking it in a percussive fashion. The most historically significant of the Delta blues singers, however, was Robert Johnson. The legend of the guitarist selling his soul to the devil to gain instrumental virtuosity was a tale perpetuated with gusto by Johnson. The performer's fame, however, did not stop with this iconic mythology. Johnson is often considered to be the greatest of the blues composers, writing works with haunting lyrics and memorable instrumental melodies. In contrast to many of his predecessors in the Delta blues genre, Johnson minimized improvisation, focusing instead on crafting tightly knit compositions. It is for this reason, perhaps even more than his technique as a vocalist and guitarist and mythological trappings, that Johnson and his music have captured the imaginations of generations of musicians. Indeed, the prolific British guitarist Eric Clapton has not only cited Johnson as a major influence, but made a famous recording of the Delta musician's composition Crossroads in 1968. Let's listen to Robert Johnson's original recording of Crossroads. Listen in the ebook to Robert Johnson's original Crossroads recording. And then you can listen to a more modern interpretation by Eric Clapton. Module 1 Glossary. Banjo. String instrument used frequently in American musical styles, including minstrel music of the 19th century. Blues. Musical genre characterized by a repetitive form, often 12 bars in length, and acting as a form of catharsis. Call and response, where one person plays or sings something, and it is responded to by another individual or group. Catharsis, releasing emotions as a means of relieving stress from them. In art, this manifests itself in various mediums where the work expresses the consumer's emotions, aiding the consumer in their emotional purging. The blues is a form of catharsis in that its melancholy lyrics about the difficulties of life help both the musician and the listener, a form of emotional relief. Congo Square, gathering place in New Orleans in the 19th century for African Americans, to observe indigenous traditions. Consonant, musical release. Dissonant, musical tension. Downbeat, the first beat of a measure of music, For example, if there are 4 beats in a measure, the downbeat would be the first beat. 1. Ethnocentrism, the viewpoint that one ethnicity is superior to another. Indigenous, native to. Konkolo, West African rhythm from which the son clave is derived. Modulation, a change to a new key in music. Negro act passed by white settlers as a result of the Stono Rebellion. Percussion, any instrument where the sound is produced by striking or shaking, like drums, rattles, xylophones, etc. Polyrhythm, many rhythms played simultaneously. Son clave, important Cuban rhythm which has influenced a great deal of American music. Syncopated, syncopation, rhythmic emphasis on the weaker beats of a measure. For example, clapping on beats 2 and 4 in a measure instead of 1 and 3. 1, 2, 3, 4. Syncretism, the blending of 2 or more distinct and originally separate cultural elements. Race records, records first produced in the 1920s which were geared directly towards African American audiences. Ring shout, a community dance in the 19th century African American culture and some parts of the southeastern United States today, where several people move in a circular pattern in counterclockwise steps to a syncopated rhythmic pattern. Stono Rebellion, African American revolt against South Carolina slave owners in 1739. Rag, name given to a ragtime composition. Ragtime, popular solo piano genre in the early 20th century, based on various 19th century influences. Transatlantic slave trade, massive economic operation which resulted in the forced relocation of over 12 million Africans to the New World. The 5 elements of African music in jazz. Number 1, emphasis on sound and the individual's production of that sound, either through their own body or an instrument crafted from the surrounding natural environment. Number 2, the prevalence of rhythm as a defining musical event, especially syncopated rhythms and polyrhythms. Number 3, music is viewed as a social activity where everyone involved is a participant. The delineation between audience and performer, so often associated with Western music, is absent. Number 4, call and response, where one person says or sings something and it is responded to by another individual or group. Structured improvisation is number 5, where it's music where new ideas are spontaneously played or sung by the performers over a pre-existing song, rhythmic pattern, or musical form. It's integral to many African musical styles and traditions. Significant people. Alan Lomax, musicologist. Antonin Dvorak, Czech composer. Bessie Smith, classic blues singer. Harry T. Burleigh, collaborator with Dvorak. He was a singer. John Philip Sousa, composer. Mamie Smith, classic blues singer. Gertrude Ma Rainey, classic blues singer. Harry Pace, record producer. Charlie Patton, Delta blues guitarist. Son House, Delta blues guitarist and composer. Bessie Smith, again classic blues singer. Reverend K. M. Williams, contemporary blues musician. Robert Johnson, Delta blues guitarist, composer, and singer. Scott Joplin, ragtime composer and pianist. Stephen Foster, 19th century American composer. William Henry Lane, minstrel performer. W.C. Handy, composer. William Krell, composer.